What if I told you that the youngest African president made a surprise call to Donald Trump? Not for politics, not for business, but to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's exactly what happened, and what President Traoré said left the world speechless. It started like any ordinary evening at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence. The sun had set over the palm trees, casting a warm glow over the luxurious estate. Inside, Trump was hosting his usual series of meetings, handling interviews with reporters, and speaking with business associates over the phone. The air was filled with the constant hum of high-profile conversations. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until the call came in. The number on the caller ID wasn't familiar, but Trump had received calls from world leaders before. He glanced at his phone and, for a split second, wondered who it might be. What caught his attention was the name displayed, Burkina Faso, a small landlocked country in West Africa. Most Americans would struggle to locate Burkina Faso on a map, and even fewer could tell you who the current leader was. But for Trump, an unexpected call from a world leader was something to consider carefully. He answered the phone, expecting it to be another diplomatic discussion, perhaps about trade agreements or international relations. What he didn't expect was the calm, yet assertive voice of a man who had recently shaken up the political world with his revolutionary ideas. "Mr. Trump," said the voice on the other end of the line. It was President Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old leader of Burkina Faso who had taken the world by storm. Traoré was still a relatively new figure on the global stage, but his leadership was already being noticed by the masses. In just a short time, he had become known for his anti-colonial stance, rejecting Western influence and pushing for African independence and self-reliance. His bold decisions and his refusal to follow the traditional paths set by former colonial powers had won him respect in many circles, but also earned him enemies. Trump, surprised but intrigued, responded, "Hello, Mr. President. It's not often I get a call from someone in Burkina Faso. What can I do for you?" Without hesitation, Traoré replied, "Mr. Trump, I have something important to say, and the world needs to hear it." Trump, intrigued by the urgency in his voice, sat up straighter in his chair. What followed was a moment that would leave the room silent. His team, who had been working around him, stopped in their tracks. No one spoke. Even the clinking of glassware and the soft shuffle of papers in the background faded as the gravity of the conversation began to set in. "I'm listening," Trump said, sensing that this wasn't going to be an ordinary call. In a measured tone, Traoré continued, "I have been watching your actions, Mr. Trump, especially during your presidency. I recognize something in your leadership, something that is rarely acknowledged by the media and the world. Your efforts to maintain peace, to avoid unnecessary conflicts and wars, have not gone unnoticed, especially from a world like ours. And for that, I am nominating you for the Nobel Peace Prize." Trump's eyebrows furrowed. He wasn't sure he had heard Traoré correctly. This young African leader was nominating him for one of the world's highest honors, the Nobel Peace Prize? It was a bold, unexpected move, especially considering the relationship between Trump's administration and many countries around the world. But what Traoré said next left Trump completely speechless. "You see, Mr. Trump," Traoré continued, "while many criticize you for your approach, I see someone who has avoided the traps of military intervention, who maintained peace through strength, who didn't succumb to the pressure to engage in unnecessary wars. That's a rare quality in today's world of power politics. You deserve to be recognized for that." Trump, for the first time in his career, was rendered speechless. He had heard praises and criticisms in equal measure over the years, but this was different. Traoré wasn't praising him for traditional diplomatic efforts. He wasn't commending him for his economic policies or even his boldness. He was recognizing Trump's ability to remain out of foreign conflicts, to build peace in his own way, and to prioritize diplomacy over military action. It wasn't the typical praise he received from his supporters, but it resonated with him in a way he hadn't expected. In a world of constant political noise and aggressive agendas, Ibrahim Traoré had just nominated Donald Trump, one of the most controversial and polarizing figures in modern politics, for the Nobel Peace Prize. It was as if the call had shattered the norms of international diplomacy and thrown everything into question. How could the world's most unlikely figure be nominated for such an honor? What did it mean for international relations? Trump, as he often did, responded with confidence. "Thank you, Mr. President. That's a surprising but very flattering gesture. I appreciate it truly." There was a pause, and the two leaders shared a moment of silent understanding. What Traoré had just done wasn't just about Trump. It was about sending a message to the world. It was about breaking the mold of conventional diplomacy and recognizing the importance of avoiding conflict when possible. As the conversation continued, the room full of Trump's staff and associates began to regain their composure. Whispers spread, and some exchanged confused looks. How had this call even come about? Why had Traoré chosen Trump for such a high honor? But the bigger question was, would the world accept this unconventional nomination? Would the Nobel Committee see the value in Traoré's recognition of Trump's unique form of peacekeeping? Or was this just another political statement, one that would challenge the status quo? In that quiet moment, the world had just witnessed an unlikely bridge being built between two very different leaders. One, a former U.S. president known for his unorthodox policies, and the other, a young African revolutionary determined to carve a new path for his continent. Ibrahim Traoré had just started a conversation that would challenge everything the world knew about diplomacy, peace, and the legacy of leadership. Ibrahim Traoré didn't pick up the phone for a simple diplomatic discussion, nor did he reach out to request favors or offer new trade deals. Instead, he called with a message of respect, recognition, and a call for the world to think differently. Traoré, the young, determined president of Burkina Faso, had watched the global stage from a unique perspective. His country, like many in Africa, had struggled under the weight of colonial legacies and Western influence. But Traoré's leadership was different. He didn't shy away from confronting the status quo. He embraced a vision of African sovereignty and independence, unafraid to challenge the powers that be. Mr. Trump, Traoré's calm voice rang out over the phone. While many may disagree with your style, I recognize one undeniable fact. You kept your country out of new wars. You were a businessman, yes. A leader, yes. But more than that, you maintained peace during your presidency when others sought conflict. Trump, known for his bold remarks and unrelenting confidence, was silent. It wasn't often that someone from such a different political landscape, especially a leader from a smaller, less powerful nation, would offer such words of praise. The silence stretched, and in that moment, the gravity of the conversation began to settle in. For Traoré, this wasn't just about offering praise to Trump for his lack of military intervention. The president of Burkina Faso was recognizing something far more profound. He was acknowledging Trump's unique ability to stay out of foreign wars, something that had eluded many world leaders throughout history. Traoré understood that true peace was not just about avoiding conflict, but also about avoiding the temptation to create new conflicts for personal or political gain. It was about recognizing the long-term effects of military action and choosing a path that prioritized stability over escalation. Traoré continued, his voice firm yet respectful. In a world full of chaos and hidden agendas, I believe you deserve something most wouldn't expect: the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize was not a title Trump had ever imagined for himself. It wasn't an accolade typically associated with his presidency, especially given his controversial decisions during his time in office. From his diplomatic challenges to his stance on global warming, many felt that Trump's tenure was characterized by division rather than peace. However, what Traoré saw, perhaps clearer than others, was the absence of war and the rejection of conflict as a political tool. In a world where many leaders sought to expand their influence through military intervention or covert operations, Trump had taken an alternative route. A route that, despite its own controversies, kept the U.S. out of new wars and protected the lives of countless individuals across the globe. For Traoré, this was worth recognizing. He knew that the world was too quick to judge Trump based on his tweets and media coverage, but in his eyes, Trump had done something few could have accomplished. He had maintained peace when everyone else seemed bent on war. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a bold statement to the international community. Traoré was challenging the conventional ideas of what leadership, peace, and global influence truly meant. In a world where power was often measured by military might and political alliances, Traoré's recognition of Trump as a peacemaker was a challenge to rethink everything they knew about the role of a leader in the modern world. This moment wasn't just about Trump's actions, it was about the future of global leadership itself. Traoré was making a statement that transcended traditional politics. He was calling for a new narrative, one where diplomacy, peace, and non-intervention were valued as much as military strength and economic dominance. It was a bold move, a revolutionary idea that challenged the very essence of how leaders were judged on the global stage. Trump was once again at the center of a conversation that would stir debate and intrigue across the world. Whether his actions deserved the Nobel Peace Prize was something that would take time to determine, but one thing was clear. Ibrahim Traoré had made an impact, and his call had set a new precedent for how leaders from different backgrounds could show mutual respect and acknowledge the unspoken efforts of others. This call had ignited a conversation that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the White House and the streets of Ouagadougou. For the world to truly understand, they would need to rethink how peace was achieved. Was it through military might, or was it through diplomatic restraint? Perhaps, just perhaps, Ibrahim Traoré's gesture was a sign of a new era, one where peace could be achieved not by force, but by the courage to avoid conflict altogether. For a man who had spent much of his life in the public eye, navigating high-stakes deals and heated political confrontations, Donald Trump was no stranger to praise or criticism. His entire career had been built on a foundation of self-confidence, quick thinking, and decisive action. Whether negotiating multi-million-dollar real estate deals or steering the U.S. government through one of the most controversial presidencies in modern history, Trump had always been ready with a sharp retort or an immediate action plan. But when President Ibrahim Traoré, a young, revolutionary leader from Burkina Faso, nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize, it was a moment of genuine surprise. Trump was used to attention, but this was different. No one had ever spoken of him in such a way. Not from a world leader, not from someone with a voice that came from the African continent, a region that had been long neglected by many in the West. Trump, taken aback by the gravity of the moment, paused. He wasn't used to silence in these moments. Normally, he would immediately respond with confidence, laying out his accomplishments and beliefs. But this time, there was a level of respect and recognition in Traoré's words that made him stop and think. The nomination didn't come with political motives or demands. It came simply as an act of acknowledgement. It wasn't about votes or alliances. It was about the recognition of an achievement that Trump had never sought, but was now being recognized for. After a few moments of deep reflection, Trump finally spoke. "President Traoré," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sincerity. "I'm honored. I've never heard that from a head of state before. Not like this. You're young, you're bold, and the world is watching you. But this means a lot." Trump's usual bravado was softened by the unexpected nature of the gesture. Here was a man who had often been the subject of ridicule, both on the world stage and at home. He had endured criticism for his approach to foreign policy, for his economic decisions, and for his bold, sometimes controversial remarks. But Ibrahim Traoré, a figure who represented something new and rebellious, was offering him an unexpected form of recognition that Trump had not anticipated. Trump leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the phone as he gathered his thoughts. "I always believed peace through strength was the way forward," he said, with a touch of his familiar resolve. "We didn't start wars. We negotiated. We built. We protected our borders but stayed out of unnecessary conflict." His tone was confident, as it always was, but this time it felt different. The sincerity in his voice seemed to transcend his usual persona. Trump wasn't justifying his decisions. He was acknowledging the complexity of the situation. The approach of avoiding new conflicts, of using diplomacy and strength together, was something that he had always believed in. Yet, here was a leader from a completely different part of the world, someone far removed from the typical political elite, seeing value in that approach. It was a moment of validation from an unexpected source. "If that's worthy of peace recognition, then I'm grateful," Trump continued, his voice softening. The weight of the words had clearly struck him. Peace was not something Trump had often been associated with in global discussions. The world often viewed him through the lens of his business career, his billion-dollar deals, and, most notably, his tumultuous presidency. Yet, here was Traoré, calling attention to something many had overlooked: the absence of war. And in a time where military action was often celebrated and conflict-driven politics were the norm, Traoré's recognition of peace was a profound moment. Trump was not only acknowledging the nomination, but also subtly embracing the principle of peace through strength that had guided much of his approach as president. He believed in a policy that didn't use military force as the first option, but rather as a last resort. He believed in diplomacy, but also in maintaining a strong defense to deter threats before they became unmanageable. Trump's foreign policy had always been rooted in the idea that peace was possible, but only through the strength to back up negotiations. The conversation, which had started as a simple, unexpected call, was evolving into something more. It was no longer just about Trump's achievements. It was about the power of global recognition from a rising leader in Africa, one who had made waves by rejecting the traditional expectations of post-colonial governance. It was about redefining what leadership and peace really meant on the world stage. For Traoré, this wasn't just a political statement. It was a challenge to the norms. He was calling for a change in how the world viewed peace and leadership, moving away from the rhetoric of military intervention and instead focusing on restraint, diplomacy, and national sovereignty. Trump's response was not just a thank you. It was a recognition of the global shift happening in places like Burkina Faso, where young leaders were standing up and saying, "We'll define our future, not based on the past, but based on what works for us now." The moment became more than just a dialogue between two leaders. It became symbolic. A bridge between old power and rising voices, between the West and Africa, between a former U.S. president and an African revolutionary leader. Trump's reply, though brief, was filled with the weight of mutual respect, one that transcended political differences. The call was not just a recognition of Trump's achievements, it was a statement of unity, of finding common ground between two leaders who came from vastly different worlds but shared a common understanding of the importance of peace and sovereignty. In the end, the call was not just about a nomination for a prize, it was about a new chapter in global diplomacy, a call for rethinking how leadership, peace, and international relations could be redefined in a rapidly changing world. As the news of President Ibrahim Traoré's nomination of Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize spread, the world erupted. What began as a single phone call between two unlikely figures soon turned into a global spectacle, shaking the foundations of international politics and diplomacy. Across social media, hashtags like Trump for Peace, #Traoré nomination, and unexpected unity began trending, sparking debates, discussions, and a flurry of opinions from all corners of the world. Some observers were stunned. How could Trump, the former U.S. president known for his divisive rhetoric, controversial policies, and frequent clashes with international leaders, be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize? Many questioned the credibility of the nomination, unsure of how to reconcile Traoré's statement with the broader narrative of Trump's presidency. Could a man who had been criticized for his handling of international relations truly be worthy of such an esteemed honor? Yet, as the debate unfolded, there were those who applauded the boldness of Traoré's move. They saw it as a brave stance, a challenge to the traditional norms of how the world viewed peace and leadership. They pointed out that while Trump's presidency was controversial, it was also marked by restraint in military actions compared to previous U.S. administrations. Under Trump, the U.S. had avoided new wars, particularly in the Middle East, a region long plagued by conflict. This alone, they argued, was worthy of recognition in a world where military intervention often seemed to be the default solution for political problems. Despite the praise, there was no shortage of criticism. Some argued that nominating Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize was irresponsible, even dangerous, given his history of aggressive rhetoric, withdrawal from international agreements, and the divisive nature of his policies. They believed that a man who had spent much of his presidency undermining global alliances and fostering political polarization should not be rewarded for peace. For these critics, Traoré's gesture was seen as misguided, a political stunt that overlooked the bigger picture. However, more interesting than the ongoing debate about Trump's eligibility for the Nobel Peace Prize was the sudden global spotlight on Ibrahim Traoré. For a leader who had been in power for only a short time, Traoré's bold move catapulted him onto the world stage. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country in West Africa, had largely been an afterthought in global politics, but in an instant, it was at the center of a conversation that spanned continents. People began to pay attention to the man who had taken on the weight of anti-colonial resistance, who had rejected Western influence, and who now, in a stunning act of diplomacy, had reached out to one of the most controversial figures in recent U.S. history. The reactions to Traoré's actions were as varied as they were profound. For many, this was not just about Trump, it was about the broader implications of global power dynamics. Traoré's nomination was more than a political gesture. It was a statement about sovereignty, independence, and the rejection of Western hegemony. It was a challenge to the established world order, a call for leaders to stand up for their values, even if it meant making unconventional alliances. Traoré's willingness to praise Trump, despite the latter's polarizing status, was seen as a bold rejection of the status quo. By doing so, Traoré was forcing the world to reconsider the way they viewed both Trump and African leadership. The reaction from the global community was swift and fierce. Political analysts from across the world weighed in. Many noted the paradox of Traoré's actions. On one hand, he was a young African leader who had risen to power through a revolutionary coup, openly criticizing colonial influence and the manipulation of African nations by Western powers. On the other hand, he was praising Donald Trump, a man who had long been criticized for his disdain for international cooperation and his unilateral approach to foreign policy. Analysts debated whether Traoré's nomination was a genuine recognition of Trump's unique peacekeeping role or a strategic move to create an opening for future alliances between Burkina Faso and the West. What was clear, however, was that Traoré had everyone's attention. The media, the political elite, and even ordinary citizens were captivated by the unexpected alliance. Some were fascinated by Traoré's courage to defy the typical political playbook and engage with Trump on his own terms. Others were critical, questioning his judgment and the true motivations behind the nomination. Regardless of their stance, one thing was certain: the world was watching Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traoré in a way it never had before. International forums and think tanks began to discuss the implications of Traoré's call. Was this an isolated incident, or was it a sign of something bigger? A shift in how African leaders would interact with Western powers? Was Traoré setting a precedent for future generations of African leaders, showing that they could assert their own power while maintaining diplomatic relationships with the world's most controversial figures? In the days following the call, global leaders and activists alike began to weigh in on Traoré's move. Some feared it would further polarize international relations, while others saw it as a glimmer of hope for a new era of diplomacy, one where the voices of the global South would be heard, even when they chose to take unconventional paths. Despite the debate, one thing was undeniable: Ibrahim Traoré had made a mark on history. By nominating Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, he had not only opened the door to a new conversation about peace, power, and leadership, but also shifted the narrative around global diplomacy in a way that no one had anticipated. His call had become more than just a nomination. It had become a symbol of defiance, strength, and the rise of new leadership on the world stage. The phone call between President Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump may have lasted only minutes, but its impact would stretch far beyond that brief conversation. In the days that followed, the world found itself discussing a deeply unexpected moment: an African revolutionary leader nominating a controversial U.S. president for the Nobel Peace Prize. The gesture was a break from the political norms, shaking up global diplomatic conversations and adding new layers to how leaders could engage with one another in an increasingly polarized world. Ibrahim Traoré's nomination was never just about recognizing Donald Trump's peace efforts. It was about setting a new tone in global diplomacy. Traoré's message was clear. Peace wasn't about being liked by everyone. It wasn't about political popularity or seeking approval from every side. Instead, it was about staying out of unnecessary conflict, preserving lives, and protecting sovereignty, even if the world's political elites didn't recognize it. In a powerful follow-up interview, Traoré elaborated on his reasoning, explaining that his decision to nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize wasn't personal. It was a matter of principle. "My nomination wasn't about liking or disliking someone," Traoré began, his voice steady but firm. "It was about facts. Peace is not about being liked. It's about avoiding war, preserving lives, and protecting sovereignty." Donald Trump, in his own way, did that. Despite all the criticisms and opposition he faced, the fact remains that his presidency did not escalate new wars. He kept the peace. In a world where military intervention was often the go-to solution for political problems, Traoré's perspective was a breath of fresh air. His words carried weight not just as a critique of the global political system, but as a revolutionary call for a new kind of leadership, one that didn't rely on strength through warfare, but strength through restraint and diplomacy. In Traoré's view, Trump's avoidance of new conflicts, especially in a region as volatile as the Middle East, was enough to justify this bold move. He wanted the world to see that peace could be achieved through smart diplomacy and the wisdom to avoid unnecessary conflicts, not through endless wars and political manipulation. For Traoré, this was also about Africa's future, about taking a step toward a self-determined continent that no longer had to rely on the old geopolitical script that had shaped much of its history. Africa, in Traoré's eyes, had been a playground for the powers that be, often sidelined in favor of Western interests and influence. By nominating Trump, a man who had defied conventional politics in many ways, Traoré was sending a message that Africa no longer needed to ask for permission to make decisions or to call out leadership. Africa was ready to speak for itself. Africa doesn't follow the old script anymore, Traoré asserted with conviction. We speak for ourselves. We think for ourselves, and we recognize leadership, even if the world calls it unconventional. His words reflected the growing sense of autonomy sweeping through the African continent, especially among its young leaders, who were determined to reshape the narrative and refuse to be dictated by outdated norms. At the same time, Donald Trump also seemed to recognize the historic nature of this conversation. In his usual fashion, he took to Truth Social to share his thoughts, praising Traoré as a leader who had seen through the manipulations of global elites. His message was simple but impactful. A strong and smart leader from Africa, someone who sees through the lies of global elites. Thank you, President Traoré. Trump's message was not just an expression of gratitude, but a recognition of the unconventional bond that had formed between him and the young African leader. It was a reflection of something that few would have predicted, a moment of mutual respect between two men from very different worlds. One, a seasoned political figure who had built his life on business and celebrity. The other, a revolutionary leader determined to break away from the past and carve out a new future for his people. Yet, in that rare moment, they found common ground. The two leaders came from vastly different backgrounds. Trump had spent much of his life navigating the elite world of New York business, media, and politics, while Traoré hailed from the streets of Ouagadougou, a young man who rose to power amidst the struggles and challenges of African politics. But despite their differences, they shared a common belief in sovereignty, the right of nations and leaders to determine their own paths without external interference. This exchange wasn't just about Trump and Traoré. It symbolized a shift in the global order, a rejection of the old paradigms where international power was shaped by the traditional elite and their alliances. Traoré's nomination of Trump was a bold challenge to the status quo, urging the world to rethink its understanding of leadership, peace, and power. It was an invitation to recognize that peace could take many forms, sometimes through diplomacy and sometimes through restraint, rather than force. In that phone call, a new chapter in global dialogue was opened. This was more than just a call between two leaders. It was a call for change, for a new way of thinking, and for a world where leadership was not defined by traditional power structures, but by a shared commitment to peace and sovereignty. The conversation between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump wasn't just about one leader nominating another for a prize. It was a turning point, a challenge to the world to start thinking about peace, leadership, and international relations in a completely new light. In that moment, two very different leaders found a rare moment of mutual respect, a moment that defied the traditional boundaries of global politics, and in doing so, set the stage for something much bigger. The possibility of a new era in diplomacy. What do you think? Can Donald Trump truly be considered for the Nobel Peace Prize? Was Traoré right to say what others wouldn't dare? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. If this story surprised you, imagine what else we're about to uncover. Subscribe now and hit that bell icon so you never miss a moment that shakes the world.